From getting an exclusive deal on your favorite music streaming platform, Spotify, to facing backlash over his Jewish remarks, Joe Rogan is pretty controversial, to say the least. In fact, it seems like his Spotify future might be in trouble. Well, at least that's what it looks like. Basically, Joe and his podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience, seem to be going downhill, and Spotify literally denied a report that he could simply bolt the streaming giant in 2023 once his contract is up. With that said, fans can't help but think about his future, especially considering the fact that Spotify's management isn't at its best either. I mean, have you heard the latest news? First, in 2022, the platform's podcast tech chief decided to leave the company once and for all. Yep, I'm talking about Michael, who joined the company back in 2019. And let's just say he pretty much managed the entire podcast team over the last couple of years. So his resignation meant things had to change around here. Not to mention, Spotify's the leading platform in the podcasting space. And Michael's even the one who helped sign the Obamas, Joe Rogan, and even Prince Harry and Meghan Markle to some pretty exclusive deals. In fact, Barack and Michelle Obama decided to move on from the platform after his resignation as well. So yeah, that was a game changer. But that wasn't all. Another podcasting executive is leaving Spotify this year. Max Cutler, who oversaw content partnerships, is going to leave by March 2023. And not too long ago, podcasting head Dawn Ostroff also announced her departure. Is it just me, or is there a pattern here? I mean, that's a huge shakeup at Spotify here. Think about it. At this point, the podcasting vertical at Spotify went through a major restructure, and I'm not sure if everyone's a fan of it, especially Joe. Did you know that Dawn literally spent millions of dollars on a bunch of exclusives and originals like the Joe Rogan Experience? As for the new chief of content and advertising head, Sahar, she's not going to report directly to the Spotify CEO anymore. Now she's got the control over the whole podcasting business. So one thing's pretty clear. Things are definitely going to change around here. And with influential people in the higher management gearing up for their departure, the replacements are ready to fill in the voids and take on new responsibilities. No layoffs, of course. Now, keeping all of that in mind, a new site claimed that Rogan could bolt Spotify and even take his 11 million listeners with him. How? Well, his contract was going to be within 2023 anyway, so maybe he'd look at it as moving to new adventures. But when a spokesperson reached out to Spotify to shed some light on this matter, the company confirmed that his contract isn't expiring anytime soon, at least not in 2023. So let's bring in the facts, shall we? There was a specific link in the original story that took you to a New York Times article from 2022, and that article claimed the contract's good to go for at least 3.5 years. And of course, if things are great by the end of it, then there's definitely a possibility of extending it. Now, rewind to 2020, and Rogan's a stand-up comedian and MMA commentator. As for his podcast, it's got millions of loyal followers watching him on Google-owned YouTube.
That's vindication.
So they banned me. They said that was my 5th strike, and that I was not allowed to tweet anymore, and my account was not available to anybody. All the previous tweets were gone.
And now he's signing this $200 million exclusive rights deal with Spotify. Surely he didn't expect things to turn around like that now, did he? And guess who signed him? Courtney Holt. That's right, the former head of studios and videos. But Holt's not around anymore, and that pretty much cut the key link that tied Joe to the platform. And if I'm being honest, 2022 wasn't the best for his relationship with Spotify. I mean, did you ever notice how frustrated he got with public demands? Forcing him to control what he could and couldn't say on the podcast wasn't something he was okay with. In fact, it got so bad that he even threatened to quit the streaming giant. But was he serious? I definitely think so, because things weren't looking so good anyway.
The people at Spotify weren't. There was just a couple of people that were like tech people that were upset. But
so then how did that become such a big story?
The real story was the medical misinformation story. That's where things got weird.
And let's face it, Joe's not the kind of person who's going to walk on eggshells and mind his own business. Nope. I mean, if you've even seen a single episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, you'll know what I'm talking about. But if you ask me, I'd say he definitely needs to look into his public remarks.
They push their advantage, they have their leverage, and they want the biggest slice of the pie. That's what they do.
I don't have a problem with that. It's when they go beyond that and they just straight up steal.
Are they stealing from you right now?
Everybody does. Every time you get in business with like corporate guys, this is how it works.
He can make some really insensitive comments easily. And on many levels, that simply isn't acceptable. For starters, his podcast is the #1 in the world right now. He's got a place where he gets to sit back, smoke weed, and meet up with pals like Elon Musk.
Do you think they would just be observing and making sure we don't blow ourselves up? Would
I don't know, man. They're real civilization. They sure are subtle. I mean, if they wanted us to know, obviously they could just,
for sure,
show up and walk down Main Street,
And even scientists like Dr. Neil Tyson.
Is reality that has filtered through your senses. And I think art at its highest is exactly that. If this was an exact depiction of reality, it would be a photograph, and I don't need the artist.
And sticking to a non-exclusive deal, he's walking on eggshells around Spotify. There's no creative control over the content, and of course, there are guidelines. Why wouldn't there be? Not only does Spotify need to meet specific standards, but Joe also has millions of followers watching. So there's a huge influence whether you accept it or not, and his controversial comments are doing any good. But that's not all. He used the N-word in a bunch of his episodes, along with controversial claims about the COVID vaccine. Sure, he apologized later for the vaccine, but that was just one of the few things he's done. Using the N-word so easily or passing insensitive comments on transgender people doesn't really fall under any acceptable standard.
Working on Roku and Apple TV. They're working on a bunch of different platforms that'll eventually be, but it's not as smooth as it probably should have been when we first transferred over in December. But they just weren't ready for the volume.
And if that wasn't horrific enough, there was one recent comment that sort of pushed way too many boundaries. His anti-Semitic comments. Director of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan, said that all of this was pretty disturbing. First, there was an active rise in anti-Jewish violence when a bunch of Americans were digging deeper into anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And what does Joe, with such an influential platform, do? He'd further encourage it. And even though his dad wasn't a big fan of his reactions either, he said that he's not prejudiced. As for Joe, in his father's words, the money went to his head and his head got bigger than his hat. He fools people. Honestly, I know a bunch of you out there are gonna agree with this. But here's the shocking part. It turns out he still didn't breach any Spotify guidelines. Really? Even after all that open insensitivity? Honestly, with how the general audience reacted to these episodes, Spotify was forced to rethink its current guidelines. Clearly, these aren't working at all. But according to sources, the music streaming giant is a pretty complicated platform, and the higher management has always stuck by Rogan. Sure, the company's policies aren't gonna support his comments, but they definitely need to switch up their guidelines, at least to make sure someone puts an end to these insensitive statements. So while we wait on the algorithmic changes and whatnot, here's where he stands right now. If and when the music streaming giant changes policies and forces him to adhere to them, Rogan isn't gonna sit by and let it happen, or at least that's what he claims. And for what it's worth, his future at Spotify is already hanging by a thread, considering all his buddies in the upper management are gone. And the replacements? Well, if I were him, I wouldn't count on them just yet. And making the move from Spotify to any other space might not be the most logical idea, considering the success of the platform. So maybe he needs to step back and figure all of that out. As for now, here's everything you need to know about his unstable Spotify future.